Mark Gurman at Bloomberg says Apple's Project Titan is pivoting. Titan is, of course, the rumored car project that's been in the works since 2014. Gurman says the new vision no longer involves Apple building its own car, but rather a self-driving car platform. CNET Roadshow's Tim Stevens has his own thoughts on the topic and joins us today. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, Megan, how are you?
Good. So everything we know about Project Titan is rumors at this point.
Everything we know.
Yeah, which makes this a bit of a weird story to cover because nothing has ever been confirmed about any of this. So we're kind of piling speculation on top of speculation. But as you mentioned, this comes from Mark Gurman, which is about as good a source as you can get.
So it's like, we're some of this we're just creating. But tell us your thoughts on the self-driving car platform from Apple based on these rumors.
Right. So Project Titan was reportedly Apple wanting to build their own car, and they wanted it to be a fully autonomous car. But according to these reports, they've ultimately determined that building a car is harder than they thought it was going to be. Surprise, surprise. So according to this latest report, they're pivoting now to develop an autonomous car solution that they could use potentially in their own car in the future, but more likely be able to go to other manufacturers and sell to them so that they could basically accelerate their own autonomousness. So basically go to GM, go to Chevy, go to Ford, and say, hey, here's our autonomous car platform, pay us money, you can plug it in your car, and you'll be good to go. The problem with this is all those manufacturers are already spending millions and millions, if not billions of dollars in developing their own autonomous solutions. So I'm a little bit skeptical that any of them are really going to want to go and piggyback with Apple here when they've all been working on this stuff for years already.
So are there any car makers that you would imagine that they could work with right now?
There are definitely some smaller manufacturers that haven't made the big investment. Manufacturers, I mentioned Subaru in an editorial that I wrote today, basically is an example of a smaller company that doesn't have hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to invest in this kind of research, and so might need a little bit of a helping hand. But even for those companies, there are already companies like Delphi and Mobileye that are developing their own independent autonomous solutions that they could work with and partner. And companies like Subaru already have partnerships with companies like Delphi. So again, it's a little bit difficult for me to imagine Apple really kind of nosing into this space and finding a lot of success unless they can come up with something that's truly revolutionary.
So along the way, there have been all these little breadcrumbs that are dropped, and this has been happening now, especially in the last year. I feel like that's really ramped up, to lead us to where we're at right now, and it seems to be coming full circle. One report, I think it was back in April, was that Tesla VP of Vehicle Engineering, former Aston Martin chief engineer Chris Porritt was brought in, was hired by Apple to work on. I mean, one could only imagine working on this project in some way, shape, or form. I mean, if it's a pivot. If it is such a thing as what we're seeing here is a pivot, I mean, would that affect kind of the working relationship with someone in that stature? I mean, coming in possibly to work on some big new beefed up, bulky, car, and instead, we're just gonna work on software. It's cool, but we could still really use your help.
Yeah, definitely. That puts a lot of those people that they poached and made very enticing offers to come to work in Cupertino. That puts them in a very uncomfortable situation because they were brought on board to build one thing. And if you are, for example, a vehicle dynamics engineer, somebody who works on suspension, if you're not building a car anymore, then that person really isn't needed anymore. So that's why we're hearing about a lot of layoffs and ultimately a lot of people just up and quitting because their jobs really aren't needed. I've definitely heard from people in the industry who would never go on the record, but who were approached by Apple to come on board and to basically do some work to help to develop an actual car. And some of them went for it, some of them didn't. But ultimately, those that did now are in a really uncomfortable situation. But the good news is there's a lot of automotive R&D going on in the Silicon Valley area. So companies like Nissan and Ford and GM all have some sort of an R&D facility in the area. So if somebody does need to leave Apple, they've got plenty of places to go. But it definitely creates an unfortunate situation where people who were brought on board, who were given very enticing offers to come to Apple, now may find themselves not needed there at all.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any guesses as to why it's not working out? Like what went wrong there?
I'm guessing there are, as always, a variety of factors that are kind of coming together. But ultimately, building a car is a really difficult thing. And that's one of the reasons I was very skeptical about this to begin with, because it just seemed like a crazy thing for Apple to want to get into. It's a hard thing to do. Safety regulations are incredibly complex, especially as you're looking at a car that you want to release globally. And the profit margins on these things are really slim. If you're making 10% on a car, you're doing really good. And that's really not the kind of numbers that Apple's looking for. So it didn't really seem to make sense to me in the beginning. But, as we heard more and more, it was looking more and more likely. But it didn't look like it was going to be any easier. And so Apple now I think they realized that ultimately they're not going to get where they want to be when they want to be there, which again was by about 2020. And so they're trying to now, I think, come up with other solutions or other things that they can do with this pool of resources that they've gathered together. And I think this is the next best path that they think that they can go down and finally make some money off of this.
So earlier we were talking about how they just hired an AI expert, and that some of the troubles that they've had with AI is that, they're such a secretive company and they don't share. And, so do you think that's part of the problem here? Like, do you see a lot of sharing among the big companies when it comes to autonomous driving technology?
There actually is an unfortunately a limited amount of sharing going on. There are very few places in the world where companies are testing their autonomous cars together. There's a place called M-City in Michigan, which is on the University of Michigan campus, where manufacturers can come together and test their cars together. But even so, very rarely do they actually do so. Still, this is largely considered to be top secret stuff. Google is probably the main exception. They're very public in terms of what they're doing and how they're developing and giving us very, very good transparency into what they're up to. But everybody else is really keeping their cards pretty close to their chest. Even companies like Ford that are relatively open with the number of cars that they have and the sort of technologies on the cars, we don't really get frequent updates from them how that testing is going. So, certainly Apple's been very, very closed door with what they're working on, not even confirming that this stuff exists. But definitely there's a lot of proprietary testing going on. As these manufacturers, they kind of want to do it themselves. They want autonomy to be kind of a standalone feature or a standout feature for them that they can use to market their cars as being better and safer and more advanced than others. And for that reason, they don't really want to work together. They want to do it on their own. They want to come up with a better solution than anybody else. And everybody's convinced that they can do that. So obviously not everyone's going to be able to do that. But there is a lot of, unfortunately, proprietary technologies that are being developed out of all this.
So you say that there's an easier way forward possibly for them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think ultimately Apple really should just refocus and redesign the interior of cars. We've seen some really cool stuff coming out of CarPlay and Android Auto, and that's a good first step. But auto interiors are a lot more complicated than they need to be, and they're a lot more, again, proprietary than they need to be. And when the iPhone came out, it wasn't really what the phone could do, but it was how it could do it. And if Apple could bring that kind of fresh perspective to the idea of an in-car infotainment system, replace the syncs and the cues and all the other horrible touchscreen interfaces that we have in cars today, replace them with something that's truly intuitive and truly a pleasure to use, that I think would be something that auto manufacturers would actually be really eager to partner up with Apple on, versus this kind of technology that all of these manufacturers are already doing on their own and already convinced that they're doing better than anybody else. So I think if they were to bring the Apple experience to the dashboard and really bring together everything from your media to your climate control settings in your car to enabling your cruise control to everything else, that I think could be something special and something that Apple could really dominate on, versus this really, really competitive and difficult field of autonomy, which is, again, something that everyone is working on already.